While Sargon, he's went insane. None of them believed this. How could you be so fucking stupid as to put the universal man right above the blank slate? So what he's trying to do in this last paragraph, worst of all, is try to say that liberals should be communists because they basically agree with them anyway, which they don't. Like, he has no 5 false assumptions about liberalism. Was there any one of those assumptions that actually were even liberal assumptions or that he showed were false? So we have right here the dumbest reading of Rousseau I have ever seen. That's essentially the philosophy of return to monkey. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy. Today's episode is going to be me reviewing Sargon's review of liberalism, I guess. Essentially Sargon of Akkad, if you've ever seen him before. He is a big political streamer here in the UK, a political commentator. He now does streams, I believe, and has his own website called Lotus he does, where he does like podcasts and that kind of thing. I used to watch Sargon actually quite a few years ago, not as someone who I like religiously watched, but more in terms of the social commentary on things like feminism. I think it was like around 2015 when he was reviewing, you know, the crazy kind of feminist meme stuff at the time. I mean, I thought he was okay back then. He was never someone who I thought, oh, you know, I politically resonate with this man. But obviously it was low-hanging fruit. You know, anyone could criticize a lot of what was going on.
You've never experienced oppression in your entire life. Neither have I. You're a white male. You're a white man.
In 2015, and likewise now, wokeism is such an easy target. So it was kind of like that. But he used to describe himself as a classical liberal back then, and I wasn't a classical liberal back then. I was a socialist. And I'm not a classical liberal now. I'm a Hegelian, a communitarian. And so we've both changed. I wouldn't say I've moved very far on the political spectrum. I'm more inclined to care about the unity of the people and the community. And so my political goals have changed. I still think that an economy should be geared towards social, the social justice, if you will, of the everyday individual, that they can receive their just desserts. You know, there is a difference in how I would approach these things now, very much more focused on community goals. While Sargon, he's went insane. So he said he wasn't a classical liberal anymore. That's fair enough. You don't have to remain a classical liberal, you know, and you can go further right. I'm not saying that you have to be left-wing, centre or anything to be rational. You can be right-wing and rational, but Sargon, as I last saw him, was calling for the illegal immigrants who are crossing the channel to be shot by the Royal Navy, which I'd like to think was hyperbolic, but it doesn't seem like that. And also because of a teacher basically said something about transgenderism, told a student off for essentially misgendering another student, and this student said that they didn't believe in transgenderism, basically, which is, again, fair enough. People are allowed to use their own reason. This shouldn't be a punishable offence, and the teacher was wrong for trying to punish it, and should have just disciplined the interaction, like, you know, what's an appropriate interaction between two students. All that aside, his response was to call for not the teacher to lose her job, you know, not for a disciplinary measure or something reasonable. No, he wanted the Secretary of Education to ban leftism from schools and so suppress the opposition. And he also is now talking about ethnicity a lot more, and how and actually even related this to a study that was done. It was a bad study as well, on how people's brains work. Essentially, immigrants will not understand British concepts or cannot understand British concepts and other more radical stuff. So he's went really pretty much just off the rails when it comes to political commentary. He's just sort of lost his freaking mind, really. This is where we're going to start. So the sort of deterioration of Sargon began when he started to reject classical liberalism, which I think began around a few years ago. He wrote articles, and this was 2 years ago, where he started to really dig into liberalism itself. These articles are trash. So we're going to go through what Sargon believes liberalism is, why he believes that, what he thinks is wrong with liberalism, let's begin with this one. The 5 false assumptions of liberalism. Without addressing the legitimate issues with these assumptions, it seems to me what liberalism as a philosophy will forever be vulnerable to having these false assumptions and contradictions exploited in ways not intended by liberal theorists. This is how critical race theory has managed to expand so widely across Western society. I'd like to point out critical theory is actually largely tied to Marxism and a Marxist and materialist approach, not liberal. It is been adopted by many radical liberals, but it's further left than classical liberalism and really nothing to do with it. Pre-social man and the state of nature. Okay, so in case anyone doesn't know anything about this, essentially the state of nature was the proposed natural state of humanity, and it was a hypothetical. No author really believed the state of nature existed. Not really. There's no evidence to say it ever did. Like, the whole point was to analyze, especially Rousseau. Rousseau specifically said it didn't, because he's a Christian, and he says actually Christians can't believe in the state of nature because of the way in which we would argue that we have been ordained to live in civil society by God. So Rousseau adamantly rejects the existence of the state of nature, but uses it as a thought experiment. And that's how it's used by the other thinkers as well, like Hobbes and Locke. But it's a thought experiment in which we propose a natural state of man. If we were to remove all the social and societal elements from man, what are we left with? What nature is it that governs human actions? Right now, this is coming off the back of a Protestant nominalist tradition in which we have been really reduced to egos. We've been reduced to our base desires. And so these thinkers are looking for a way to structure ethics and politics in such a way as to mediate the problems, ethical issues within society. We're looking for a way to found ethics. And so they are looking for a form of ethical naturalism, grounded in essentially base sociality and human nature, if that explains what the state of nature is. Predicated on the concept of man in a state of nature, Grotius, Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and doubtless others have considered the state of nature to be a possible theoretical state in which man was dispersed in the wilderness, living off the land and fighting wild animals and only occasionally encountering other humans. So, most of these philosophers admit that the state of nature is purely a thought experiment and did not really exist in nature, but this did not prevent them from taking it as a starting point from which the liberal philosophy developed. Now, that is true. Now, needless to say, modern archaeology and common sense suggest that there was never a point in time which man was actually a solitary animal. Yes, pretty much all of them agree. Instead, man seems to have always lived in small tribal bands, as the earth is dangerous and difficult to survive by oneself, and even in the contemporary great apes, they tend to live together in small bands, right? So the first and most fundamental assumption about the nature of man in history is wrong, and leads us to further wrong assumptions, further we extrapolate from it. How did he manage to turn that into a false assumption? So they all agree, right? Most of these philosophers admit this is purely a thought experiment, right? So what they're really saying is that man is self-interested, right? And so the position they're starting from is essentially egoism. Now, I'm not an egoist, but if you're going to argue against egoism, you're going to have to say why it's wrong, right? And nothing about egoism goes against the fact that man has always lived in small tribes, because all of them philosophers would also agree with that. So he's debunked egoism because humans are social. But in the next article, he says, in that article, I covered the wrong assumptions of man in the state of nature. This statement rests on the idea that man is born in the state of nature. As we have covered, there was never a state of nature as early Enlightenment thinkers envisioned it. And this is specifically targeted to Rousseau. Man is born free. Rousseau said, the investigations we may enter into in treating this subject must not be considered as historical truths, but only as mere conditional and hypothetical reasonings, rather calculated to explain the nature of things rather than to ascertain their actual origin. Rousseau also goes on to say that it would be unchristian to believe that the state of nature actually existed because it goes contrary to biblical teaching. And he's a Christian. So, I just wanted to point that out before we move on it. He thinks this has defeated Rousseau's man is born free. But we'll get on to that. Everyone is equal. The liberal view of equality is derived from the assumption that there was a pre-social man. It's actually derived from the equality of human nature. So remember, most of these thinkers don't believe that this existed, but he is saying that it is derived from the idea of a pre-social man. So Hobbes, rather, basically argues that in the state of nature, there is an equality of interests, because if you discard all interests and only seek for yourself, you'll be murdered. Because you're going to have to play the political game. Because otherwise, they'll just ban up against you and they'll murder you. The equality in the Hobbesian view is essentially based around power relations and equality of interests, that we all equally care about our own interests as much, and so can't be absolutely discarded without causing a state of war. In Locke, it's that we share the same human nature, okay? That we all have the same fundamental nature, which is to be self-interested, to be rational, and essentially have the same inalienable rights. In Rousseau, it's that we are self-interested and that we are interested in others. So their view of equality is, it's not an equality in the sense that we are all born physically equal, or that we are all, like as in material equal, or that we are all equally as rational, or that we are all equally as powerful, or whatever. For Hobbes, it's that we all care about ourselves equally. For Locke, it's that we all have the same shared relationship to ourselves. It's a psychological relationship to ourselves. And with Rousseau, again, it's a psychological relationship to ourselves. So the liberal view of equality is derived from the assumption that there was a pre-social man. Prior to the advent of liberalism, European life was deeply hierarchical, and there were formal social ranks from which one was born into, and on occasion, to which one could ascend. These ranks were underpinned by a deeply religious order that assumed that the world had been organized in the way it was by God himself. Well, that's absolutely bollocks. The divine right of kings, maybe, and that was still contentious. Not everyone affirmed the divine right of kings, and there was a time in which it didn't exist. When we're talking about the overall social hierarchy of Europe being ordained by God himself, no one believed that. The lords and the various aristocrats would murder each other, go to war, they would trade with each other, marry for power, increase and lower their social status. It was largely representative of not a godly kingdom, right? Where it's like your place is essentially a caste, as in something like in Hinduism. It's definitely not like that. Britain was not Britain, but medieval Europe even was not a caste-based structure. Man has always been a social being. As such, there have always been hierarchies in human society. Even these differences between the upper and lower strata is as minuscule as the tribal patriarch being given the deference by the younger man. Again, we see the same social stratification play out in chimpanzee tribes. With any kind of social organization, someone has to be in charge. There has never been a time in which man was socially equal, as the liberal thinkers asserted. What's ridiculous about this is that, one, we've already accepted this as a thought experiment, right? So you can't just say, because this didn't happen, liberalism's untrue. Liberalism isn't arguing that there wasn't social hierarchies in human history, right? Like, no liberal thinker is arguing for that. And no liberal thinker is pointing out that the state of nature actually existed. It's a thought experiment used to derive rational justifications from a hypothetical. It is purely a hypothetical used to evoke a means of reasoning, right? This isn't like historical fact. What they are looking towards is a foundation of what we can assume about the nature of man versus his societal existence, and how one society could be justified over another, and what would be the better society if we could confer its existence in relation to the interests and the reason of every man. So this was very much based upon an egoist morality, from the foundation that everyone is self-interested, that you are forming social bonds because you are self-interested, and that because you are self-interested, that can be then used as a foundation for political and moral justification. So this is dumb as shit, to be frank. But what's worse is then he goes on to for whatever reason to engage in anthropology talking about and referring to us in terms of chimpanzee tribes. Even if this was the case, that is a chimpanzee and not a human, and these thinkers would be, I think, horrified at the idea that you would equate chimpanzees and humans precisely for the fact that humans can reason and chimps cannot. So, unfortunately, Sargon, no. This is, again, not a false assumption. You haven't shown it to be a false assumption. Please stop. But he's not going to stop. Because now, he's going to get on to the really stupid stuff. So this is where I start getting annoyed, right? So, the universal man. Early liberal thinkers recognized that much of what differentiates, say, an Englishman from an Amazonian tribesman originated from their social customs and institutions. Right? Very true. Without the educational institutions, scientific development, and accumulation of traditions, among many other factors, the Englishman would be difficult to differentiate from any other savage. And the point is to say that if we are, as they assumed, right, particulars, okay, that we are particular individuals who can be understood only as particulars, right? A particular is like a unit, a monad, something which is separate from others. It has a specific and limited existence, okay? Now, this was contrary to the tradition that was being rejected, which was Aristotelianism, which was, actually, you are part of a universal. That universal is the universal nature of man, as ordained by God. And so when you look at something natural, you gain what's called the species essence. And instead, the liberal thinkers are arguing that species essence, either one, doesn't exist, as in Hobbes. There is no such thing as a species essence. There's no such thing as a universal, right? So there is no nature for man. There is only his self-interested particularity, right? There is only his desires. And for Locke, it's conceptual. It's something that is formed through our understanding of the particulars. It has real existence, but only in our minds. And whether that actually relates to reality or not is questionable. And so it's a corpuscular, atomistic model being built up from our understanding of essentially a particularized atomistic world. So it runs parallel. Whether it relates to the world or not is questionable, but there are these bubbles, these sets, these universals that are formed, these generalizations. Whether they actually apply to existence is questionable. But we are all, for Locke, again, born tabula rasa, right? A blank slate. So there is no essential nature in the same way that an Aristotelian or a Platonist would argue. The exaggerated realist argues for a real universal nature. The indifferentist argues for a real universal nature. Liberal thinkers come from a tradition which explicitly denounces this. Okay? By subtracting the cultural artifacts of each society, one can extract a kind of universal platonic form of a human being. He has a head, 4 limbs, a body, and certain universal needs. None of them believed this. It wasn't a universal form, right? It was, when we see a human, we categorize them as such because they have 4 limbs, right? A head, rational thinking. That's basically what we have determined to be a human, right? Which basically means that we put the particulars into the group, which was an artificial construction. Not that everyone necessarily shares this essential nature. Okay? They rejected this. It was a definite rejection of this, especially for Locke, right? And Hobbes, especially for Locke and Hobbes, actually. Therefore, all men in the state of nature, it is reasoned, must have been essentially the same and equal in all ways. They must have been this theoretical universal man who belonged to no culture, existed in no time, and could be located in no place. No, that's not what any of them believe. They believe through constant conjunction, they have come to form generalizations about the world, some which obtain, some which don't. But one generalization that seems to obtain is that all of us are self-interested. And so they are forming these generalizations built up off of constant conjunctions. Their experiences specific experiences with particular individuals. It's not an argument and an appeal to a universality or universal human nature. Quite the contrary. When Locke's putting forward a natural law, he is actually saying that this natural law is essentially developed from our reasoning, which is allowing us to sort of form these universals and then apply them to nature. Whether they obtain or not is questionable. But to say that there is this universal human nature, and that's what we're appealing to, only if we can obtain it through reason, as in like we constantly see this nature again and again and again. So it's not like all men exist in a certain way, in a certain form. It's more like our idea of universal man is being formed by our real encounters with humanity, okay? However, as we have seen, this is a false assumption that cannot be applied to any human who has ever lived. Whilst all humans do have physical needs imposed on them by nature, one of those needs is other human beings. That they are physical beings ensures that none of them can be a universal man. Every human who has ever lived has been a product of time, place, culture, and heritage, and carries the cultural baggage of his inheritance. One, this is stupid as shit because they don't believe in this Platonic form, which is this archetypical idea of man, right? They are rejecting this and instead saying that their idea of man is derived from reality. They are abstracting it, right? This is conceptual abstraction, right? Not application. And two, right? This rejects what was indifferentism, right? So there was a tradition prior to this in which the universality of a being was embodied in their concrete particularity. So it only existed because they existed in a particular time, in a particular place, right? What this is arguing against is a specific conception of exaggerated realism as given by Plato. This is only useful against Platonists. It can't be used against Aristotelians, indifferentists. It can't be used against conceptualists, and it certainly cannot be used against nominalists. And all of these thinkers, not one of them was an exaggerated realist. Okay, like I'm just going to point that out. Like, none of the liberal thinkers that we are going to reference today, and by the way, he never references Kant, was an exaggerated realist. None of them. The only universal consideration of universal nature that was in any of them was in the intuitions, in the rational nature given by Kant, right? Like, to be rational is essentially part of the nature of man because that's how you're conceiving of reality, right? It's the universal categories. But like, again, his idea of the self goes beyond our experiences. It's the noumenal self, right? So it's not something you know. It's not something that you assume. It's something that, there's another human. He has the categories of the understanding, right? Anyway, they have existed in this state of nature and they have never existed in this state of nature and therefore are not spontaneously produced in the form of man. Instead, they are shaped differently by their environment and societies to hold different values, have different attributes, and want different things. When does any liberal thinker not accept this? The only time that you would see something different is to say that Hobbes thinks that we all want what we want, or almost tautologically, right? You cannot help but be self-interested. So he doesn't say what content you will want. Everyone wants different content depending upon the accidents of their experiences, which they all accept, but they all want what they want. And that's basically what every single liberal thinker thinks. Same with John Locke, tabula rasa, in fact. Everything comes from, you're a blank slate. Same thing for Hobbes, you're a blank slate. For Rousseau, you're essentially born with self-interestedness and an interest in others. They are arguing from the exact inverse of this position, right? And what's worse, he's about to actually talk about how they argue from the exact inverse of this position. So how does he go from the universal man, okay, the idea that there is this universal humanity, this Platonic form from which they are applying, to the blank slate, tabula rasa, which was a rejection of the universal man. It's a rejection of innate ideas. Tabula rasa is the philosophy that goes against this right here. How could you be so ficking stupid as to put universality, the universal man, right above the blank slate and think that you are criticizing liberals? Like, he's just an idiot. Like, I'm sorry to say, right? How could you read, right? How can you read, right? John Locke. How could you read Thomas Hobbes? Thomas Hobbes even more so, right? But let's say John Locke, right? Tabula rasa, the blank slate, right? His ideas, everything's built up off impressions to the point in which the laws of logic themselves are actually universals built from the most complex experiences. These are complex. These are not simple. These are not innate. These are developed, right? So the laws of logic themselves are not innate for Locke. He will not accept that you at birth can differentiate the law of identity, that you know the law of identity. He's like, you do not know the law of identity. You will develop that through your rational capacities. You will start to realize that actually something cannot be itself and not itself at the same time, right? Like, that's like how he believes you will essentially develop, okay? But that in you is essentially, in your nature, in your particular nature, derived by God himself, you will find that there are certain truths. The same truths that we can derive, general truths that we derive in physics, the same truths that we derive in biology. And so this is where he starts to talk about natural law. So his idea of natural law was nothing to do with universals. It's nothing to do with Platonic forms. It's to do with generals, right? Generalizations, which are produced from particulars, because all that truly exists are particular, right? Now that's the point, right? So this here is stupid as shit, right? This is stupid as shit. The blank slate. Okay, so another false assumption, liberal assumption that follows from the previous point is that the human being is essentially a blank slate upon whom society imposes its culture, and without which he would have no programming at all. Do all liberals believe this? All liberals believe we are a blank slate? Because certainly Kant didn't, because Kant was influenced by the rationalist tradition. Right? So Kant, as a liberal, as one of the most prolific liberals of all time, who proposed the League of Nations, or the UN, basically, he never believed we were a blank slate. Kant was the exact opposite. He believed that we had these categories of the understanding inherently, and that's what it meant to be a human. However, it's not like a Platonic form. It's a kind of conceptualism. It's a necessary prerequisite for you to understand and conceive of reality. And so this is the intuition. So he's rejecting the tabula rasa, but he's not arguing for a universal Platonic form of humanity. And in fact, it seems to be more your specific soul bringing you into existence. Or maybe you could argue for God, right? But really, it's your soul, right? So he's, again, a neo-Lutheran, and he is very much closer to the Protestant nominalist side of things. There are universals in our phenomenal experience, but again, they are in our experiences, not in nature itself, right? Which is why he comes up with the idea of the noumena. So it's a conceptualism. And what's worse, the ones that do believe in the blank slate can't be arguing for a universal nature of man. So the liberals that do believe in this can't believe in this, and the liberals that don't believe in this don't necessarily have to believe in this. So it's the worst of all worlds. And so I want to point out that this part here that he's referencing, right? This part, right, is a deliberate attack, right, on this, right? This part, right, was written, right, by the author to attack this. The whole point of this section to attack this. Okay? I don't really have a problem with denying the existence of the blank slate. What I have a problem with is that other liberal thinkers also deny the existence of the blank slate. So this can't be, because you even get Hegelian liberals. This can't be a rejection of a false assumption of liberalism. This is just a false assumption of Locke. The concept of blank slate also contradicts the liberal doctrine of innate goodness of man. Locke doesn't believe in the innate goodness of man. He doesn't believe we're good or bad. If a man is removed, and the goodness of man in Rousseau, right, isn't that we are inherently good in that we necessarily only want to love and care for each other. It's more that until the point of social convention, we haven't formed prerequisites of egotism, which he sees as essentially the basis of selfishness. We're more like animals in the sense that we would see these animals as essentially neither good nor bad, but good in themselves is that they only act in relation to what is not that they're naturally inclined towards. And that natural inclination is to essentially self-satisfy and satisfy others in cases where it's appropriate. So there's nothing negative there, but only goodness. We all naturally seek our own good because we are self-interested, and he's arguing from a basis of egoism. If Locke doesn't believe in the innate goodness of man, and he's the one putting forward tabula rasa. If Kant doesn't believe in tabula rasa, if Hobbes doesn't believe people are innately good, and Rousseau, who this is usually meant to represent, he acknowledges does not believe that they are good or evil. Who the fuck is, where is this even meant? How is this meant to be a counter of any liberal who existed ever? Mate, you've just said that it goes against the doctrine of the innate goodness of man, but Rousseau doesn't believe in it. Locke doesn't believe in it. Hobbes doesn't believe in it. Kant doesn't believe it. This is painful. Painful. At least write a coherent paragraph. Or rather a non-contradictory paragraph, I should say. Who cares, right? Why actually care what anyone thought, says? And, why make a non-contradictory point? You'd actually have to care, Equality of opportunity. In the state of nature, everyone has the same opportunity to accomplish nothing. In the state of nature, everyone has the same opportunity to accomplish nothing. What? Do we? Nobody has the same opportunity because we all start at different levels of wealth, capacity, etc. The moral demand for equality for all opportunity bleeds into a demand for equality of outcome. Liberals are like the worst, right? He is confusing right now liberals, right, with communists. And even not communists. Not even communists argue for this. Actually, Marx said this is a bourgeois notion of equality. The liberals, none of them, no liberal, maybe Rousseau, but only in that you participate in the general will, that we all demand the same outcome in terms of our civil society. That doesn't mean that we all have the same the same place in society. It just means that we are all equal in terms of hierarchy. That we are all equal in terms of our, we are treated as equal in terms of our interests, in terms of our rights. Not to say that everyone will have the same, that everyone will have the same, money and wealth and power, but rather that we are all equally bound to the general will. Okay. Now, the general will doesn't necessarily have to will that everyone have the same in terms of equality of outcome. But that's the most radical thinker. Locke certainly doesn't argue for this. Hobbes argues the inverse of this, if anything. And Kant doesn't argue for this. So who is he talking about here that argues for equality of outcome? John Rawls, contemporary liberal thinker, wrote what was called the argument for justified inequality. So liberals, if anything, are usually the ones famous for arguing that inequality can be justified in line with the rights of others, that you would be imposing upon others something unjust if you were to not respect a level of inequality that benefited all. So no. Even someone like John Rawls, who's like looking like, okay, if we were to just politically, right, devolve ourselves from everything, all of our concerns, from our different levels of wealth and capacity, from everything, this would be irrational. So even John Rawls, right, who I'm quite sure that this is probably aimed towards, right, who's basing his philosophy off Rousseau and is a little bit more radical because he makes it only a political doctrine, still thinks this is irrational, right? So, as philosopher Robert Nozick put in Anarchist State and Utopia, the socialist society would have to forbid the capitalist acts between consenting adults. So one, that is a socialist society and not a liberal one, you dolt. But two, he's arguing from the perspective of John Locke. The whole point of Robert Nozick's position is to affirm the Lockean consideration of inalienable rights and say, and because of these rights, we can't affirm John Rawls's position. So he uses a liberal thinker against a liberal. He affirms John Rawls against the Kantian, Rousseauian political liberalism of John Rawls. So John Locke versus Rousseau and Kant. So this is, again, a liberal critiquing a liberal. So cannot be a false assumption of liberalism, because liberals, as we are being demonstrated, do not affirm this. Depriving people of the ability to possess the fruits of their labor. I mean, the irony is that it's absolutely not about. It's the whole point is that people should be able to possess the fruits of their labor. That's the exact argument in Marx. You should possess the fruit of your labor, and the problem is that you are being alienated from the means of production, which is essentially alienating you from your labor, and it's one of the forms of alienation within the Marxist critique of capitalism. So whether that's true or not, right, is separate, but that's not what Marxists want to do. I'd like to point out that other liberals, such as Adam Smith, who wrote about the division of labor, who wrote about the ways in which liberal economics function, would certainly not be arguing for forced equality, because he's arguing for the invisible hand of the market. So he's arguing for a capitalistic market in order to maintain the interests of everyone based upon a liberal egoism. So I'm just wondering right now, and I hope you're all wondering too, what liberal he's talking about, because no liberal wants this. So yeah, I don't believe we are put on this earth merely to serve the perspective of a universal idea. Neither does any liberal. So created an inequality which liberal theorists object, then so be it. This is not justification enough to deprive me of what is rightfully mine, nor that which is rightfully or anyone else's. Those rights from which he's referencing, what is rightfully mine, they were liberal rights. Though there is plenty of liberals that'll be like, yeah, that's right, they can't take your rights, these inalienable rights away from you. The communist will argue that all these forms of inequality are a form of unfairness, and that this is different for the liberal to disagree with, as in many ways he is already committed to the presupposition it is unfair that people aren't equal. The only question is in which way they are unequal. No, they haven't committed to the presupposition that it's unfair that people are unequal. They don't give a shit. The only thing they don't want is an inequality of justice, right? In Rawls, that means being unfair, being inconsiderate of others and their social position. And that's as radical as it gets. The liberal prescribes some forms of equality as outside of this consideration, while the communist includes all forms of equality for consideration. No, they don't, as Marx said, that this was a bourgeois notion of equality. So what he's trying to do in this last paragraph, worst of all, is try to say that liberals should be communists, because they basically agree with them anyway, which they don't. So that is the first one. How did you find that? Because I found that incredibly painful. He doesn't have a fucking clue what liberalism is. Like, there is nothing in this. Like, he has no 5 false assumptions about liberalism. Was there any one of those assumptions that actually were even liberal assumptions or that he showed were false? So, general assumptions of liberalism that he showed were false. There's ones where he actually even contradicted himself, man. Like, actively contradicted himself. Like, one after the other. 5 more assumptions. Man is born free. So, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. This statement from the opening paragraph of the social contract is powerful and false. It's a powerful and false claim that underpins liberal philosophy. It only underpins Rousseau's philosophy, actually. But, okay. Though it is a compelling way of framing this argument, Rousseau's assumptions are simply incorrect. This is a common thread that runs through most liberal theorists, as their view rests upon man being a perfectly free agent in the state of nature who sacrifices some of his rights to enter into society. They sacrifice their own freedom in the sense they sacrifice their own capacity to commit retribution and so on, but you choose to essentially restrict yourself for greater freedom in the end. Rousseau is making a point here that you can't renounce your own liberty because your liberty is your desire for yourself, for your own good, in the same way that Hobbes is making. So when he says man is born free, he means man is born self-interested. But everywhere he is in chains, one thinks he is the master of others, but he is a greater slave than they. That's what Rousseau's saying. So Rousseau's not just saying, like, man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. And he's like, but without society, we aren't... Like, what he's saying is that everyone is born to be self-interested and only will their own, what is good for them, right? But once we enter society, we are subverted by a social structure which makes us believe that if we achieve more and we climb a social hierarchy, that at the end we'll be more free, but if anything, we'll be more enslaved. And he gives the example of a politician who essentially is a demagogue. He's a populist. He has to bend to the will of the people. Everything that he does is essentially scrutinized, and his life is miserable because everything that he has to do is prescribed by what others expect of him. And these expectations don't actually align with what would be good for him. They make him miserable. They make him unhappy. And he's doing what everyone wants him to do rather than what he wants himself. And so he goes on later to say, he goes on prior to this actually, to say, there's 2 quotes I'm going to read here actually. So one is against slavery. To renounce your liberty is to renounce your status as a man, your rights as a human being, and even your duties as a human being. There can't be any way of compensating someone who gives up everything. Such a renunciation is incompatible with man's nature. To remove all freedom from his will is to remove all morality from his actions. Finally, agreement to have absolute authority on one side and unlimited obedience on the other, what an empty and contradictory agreement that would have to be. And isn't it the fact alone that the fact that there is no equivalence, nothing to be exchanged between two sides, enough to nullify the agreement? What right can my slave have against me? Everything that he has is mine. His right is mine, and it doesn't make sense to speak of my right against myself. So that's one. That's when he's talking about like radical oppression, where it's like literal chains, slavery. When he's talking about on freedom and slavery of desire, he says we could add on the prophet side the fact that in the civil state man acquires a moral liberty, which alone makes him truly master of himself. For the drive of sheer appetite is slavery, whilst obedience to a law that we prescribe to ourselves is liberty. But I have said too much about this in other places, and the philosophical meaning of the word liberty doesn't concern us here. Right? So when he talks about that, I want to point out the fact that Rousseau himself is actually saying there, man is not born free. Man is freed by society. He's freed from his natural sheer desires through morality. Okay? What he's all he is saying in man is born free and everywhere he is in chains, one thinks he is the master of others, but he is a greater slave than they, is that in a lord and, well, what would Hegel will take this to be, a lord and bondsman relationship, a master-slave relationship, a relationship between two parties hierarchizing, that you are enslaved by a desire that is impressed upon you by a social construct which harms you in the end. You are committing yourself to the wants and appetites of others without realizing it. That's what Rousseau is getting at. So let's move on. Let's see what he thinks Rousseau means. There never was a state of nature. As early Enlightenment thinkers envisaged it, man was never an isolated being roaming the wilderness on his own. Right? Yes, Rousseau also agrees. He said, as I mentioned earlier, the investigations we enter into in treating this subject must not be considered as historical truths, but mere conditional and hypothetical reasons, rather calculated to explain the nature of things than to ascertain their actual origin. Okay? So he definitely goes against this. And again, he says that as a Christian, no Christian can even believe in the state of nature because they affirm what's called the state of innocence, and that man ordained, that man ordained men to live in a civil society. Essentially, it's in the gospel. It is not so socially true that man is born free. He is not born devoid of the bonds that Rousseau believes society chained him, in which he seeks to break. No, Rousseau doesn't want to break from society. He wants to break from unjust society. He specifically says, each of us puts in his person and all his power in common under the same supreme direction of the general will, and in our corporate capacity we receive each member an indivisible part of the whole. This act of association replaces the individual person status of each contracting party by a moral and collective body composed of by as many members as the assembly has voices, and receiving from this act its unity, its common identity, its life and its will. This public person that is formed by the union of all persons used to be called the city, and these days it's called the republic or the body politic. Rousseau wants you to put all of your energy, all of your capacities towards absolute unity. Right? So if he wants you to put all of your capacity towards absolute unity, why does he want you to break all of the social bonds? He doesn't. He just wants you to break some of them because he thinks some of them are unjust. So we have right here the dumbest reading of Rousseau I have ever seen. It sounds like, to me, someone has picked up something like SparkNotes, maybe Wikipedia, by someone, I mean Carl, has went on Wikipedia and went, what does Rousseau think? Although I'm willing to bet Wikipedia has a better explanation of Rousseau. A child has an obligation to listen and obey their parents. Yes, I mean, Rousseau's going to say that this is true, and the parents have a duty to love and care for their child. 100%. I mean, Rousseau wrote on the philosophy of education, I suggest reading Emile, and how to best raise a child. Like, he's not very good at it. I mean, his actual social, his relation to his own kids was trash, but he did actually acknowledge this, believe it or not. Neither one is free of these social statuses, nor should they be. It is entirely detrimental to both parties if they were not connected in this way. 100%. I mean, Rousseau would agree. Freedom from these bonds is not desirable, and man is not born free from them. Again, Rousseau is only pointing out that we are born self-interested. Everything else we have learned is conventional. We pick it up from after our natural relation to our family has ended. We've already been acclimated into a social organization which has socially conditioned us, which is basically what Rousseau is famous for pointing out, into a form of life which is either good or bad, or a combination of both, right? And Rousseau's trying to say that Ultimately, civil society is the best way to go, but we need to radically change it. So have bonds, but have the right bonds. Babies are completely dependent upon their parents for the entirety of the time that they are babies. Rousseau points this out. And even later into their childhood. Rousseau also points that out. Moreover, babies are completely enthralled by their passions and have no rational capacity to make decisions. Even if they had the physical capacity to execute them, it is simply not true that man is born free. I would like to move back to the fact that Rousseau said, we could add on the prophet side that the fact that the civil state, a man acquires a moral liberty which alone makes him truly master of himself, for the drive of sheer appetite is slavery. So Rousseau pointed this out long before Karl believed that he was criticizing Rousseau. Yeah, he has no fucking clue what Rousseau's talking about when he says man is born free. So apparently, man is born free. False assumption, guys. You got to understand, Rousseau doesn't know what he's talking about. Social contract theory, however, seems to fail to stand up to scrutiny on its origins. Who signed it and when? How do we break it? How do we renew it? And why aren't we able to withdraw from it? Why can't we modify it? So social contract theory isn't meant to, I think this is a genuine problem for social contract theory, but not in the way in which Karl is essentially outlining it. Social contract theory is a problem because you're already assuming that an individual can sign a contract, right? That they can understand it implicitly, that all of this can form without the necessary social relations between individuals already pre-existing the contractual relation. However, he's asking the questions essentially, who signed it and when, right? You all sign it all the time by having social interrelations, by having certain rights, by engaging in a body politic. So the continued existence of the state is the social contract. Your participation in the state, which includes the market, is essentially your participation in the contractual agreement. It's not an actual literal signing of it. It is what is called tacit consent. That once you engage in certain activities with others, you have consented to respect those others in relation to certain conventions and norms and laws which interrelate those parties. And those laws and conventions have been birthed from social engagements, from rational social engagements. We essentially create power structures in order to govern and essentially mediate social interactions. And once you start engaging with those institutions, you've tacitly accepted the terms and conditions, if you will. How do we break it? You break the law. It's as simple as that. You break the law. Yeah. How do we renew it? What do you mean renew it? It's not like a Netflix subscription, mate. Like it's not like I don't know what to say. Like, what do you mean? How do you renew it? Like, it never went away. It's the society. We die. It doesn't. Right? Why aren't we able to withdraw from it? You are able to withdraw from it. For Locke, for example, you can leave. You just can't take your property, which is institutionally bound to it, because that property was produced from within the bounds of the contract itself. So you can leave the contract, you just can't take anything that was produced or manifest from the contract itself. If you want to go and live in the woods, no one is going to stop you from living in the woods. Why can't we modify it? You can modify the institutions which are developed from this initial interaction in the contract. So you actually can modify the sort of hierarchies, the rights, the inceptions of rights, and so on. But Locke's going to say you're not going to want to do that, for example, because these are natural rights, that these have been derived from reason. Basically all societies in the world are coming to the same conclusions. Rousseau's going to say that you actually want to modify this social contract or this sort of contractual arrangement to be a genuine contractual arrangement and rather not a perversion, which is essentially what's happened in society. So, no, you can modify it. So, again, he has no idea what he's talking about. Almost all social contract theorists are forced to fall back on the position that tacit consent is inferred from silence. No, it's not inferred from silence, it's inferred from action. They're saying that because you are participating in these institutions, you're agreeing to the rules and the laws and conventions of these institutions, right? And again, I would like to point out that Locke is a revolutionary. He was one of the first revolutionaries, as is Rousseau. Rousseau's less in many ways revolutionary than Locke. Funnily enough, although he gets the credit for the French Revolution, he wasn't part of it. Where Locke was very much alive and well and making and arguing for political points at the time of the English Civil War. Locke's a revolutionary, and he's going to say that if you believe that society is trampling upon your rights, then you appeal to the various institutions. You go up, you go up, you go up. And eventually, if the head of state is implicit in the rights violations that you're engaging with and that you all agree you're engaging with, then central justice is not working, and you must appeal to divine justice. You appeal to God. That means you revolt. So you have a right to revolt in Locke. And that is essentially it's not going against the social contract, but essentially re-establishing the social contract. So, yeah. If the authority itself break the social contract, you have a right to it. You don't dissolve the social contract. And you couldn't, dissolve it. The whole point is that you can choose to leave it, or you can choose to renew it. You can't choose to you can't choose to as a group decide to dissolve it, because that would be, we're going to decide. That's essentially the philosophy of return to monkey for these thinkers, right? Like, you're actually saying we are going to become apes again. We are not going to socially interrelate. We aren't going to set up social conventions and norms and institutions which are essentially built from our capacities of reason. We are essentially going to dissolve this relationship. And so the only thing that would dissolve it is an absolute state of war. Like, you would just fall into a state of war. If an overwhelming majority of citizens were in objection, as it's talked about, that was Locke calling for revolution. So he's actually calling for the establishment of the social contract, or the renewal of it, in relation to the violation of duties of a government, which this is written right there. Simply withdrawing of consent. You could just leave. No one's stopping you from leaving. Locke doesn't believe that you shouldn't be allowed to leave. Hobbes doesn't say anything about that. I don't think Rousseau's he's going to say that it's not in your best interest, but he's not going to stop you from walking into the woods. I mean, you could collectively wander off into the wilderness. All of these have been proposed by social contract theorists, but none of these explanations are able to explain why, when the conditions are met, the society and state persists. Why do the police not simply abandon their duties, setting a breach of the social contract when the government suppresses a civil right? Well, they can. If there is they can appeal to, and Locke talks about this, appealing to the various levels of government, all the way to the point in which it can lead to a revolution. Rousseau also is a revolutionary. Why are people able to withdraw consent from social contract in order to evade taxation? Because you're engaging in the institutions of the state, and the taxation is essentially the cost of maintaining those institutions. How can the population persuade the state to organize a vote to abolish itself? You can't vote to get rid of voting. Where is one supposed to actually go when withdrawing from the social contract, since all land comes under some jurisdiction or other? If you wanted to, I mean, like, let's be honest, like, if you wanted to break all bonds of fellowship, and just wander off into the wilderness, you can. No one's going to stop you. People have done that before. The problem that the social contract theorists have, of course, is that no such event of entering into one has ever occurred. Social contract is founded on the idea that the state of nature existed, which again, they all said it didn't, and you even accepted, which I showed in my previous article, it did not. But in the previous article, I would like to remind you all, he even mentioned, right? So he's saying, as I showed in my previous article, the state of nature never existed. It never existed. Idiots. Buffoons. How could they be so stupid? Oh my God. Okay, right. In the previous article, he says, most of these philosophers admit the state of nature is purely a thought experiment and did not exist in reality. But don't they realize that it never existed? The absolute morons. To know that you've wrote in the same article that you're referencing that these people didn't believe this was an actual time and place. And what they're talking about is a hypothetical agreement. Essentially, explains why people engage socially with each other and the benefits of engaging socially with each other. It's it's like he's purposefully misrepresenting them, though. And you know it's not meant to be a historical take because you said that you know that these thinkers don't think it's a historical take. Moreover, such a position requires that we make the assumptions that fail to make sense. Take, for example, the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. A great deal of this is presupposed in this statement in the beginning of the first word. We. Who is we in this context exactly? Certainly not a disparate group of individuals wandering the wilderness of the North American continent. The 13 colonies were hundreds of years old by the time of the Declaration of Independence, which existed as a settled extension of England with all of the laws, customs, technology and governance that comes with being part of a venerable civilization. So I'd like to point out that the legal document that pre-existed the Constitution of the United States was the Declaration of Independence. Right? And the Declaration of Independence is the rejection of the unfair dynamic that they were given in their relationship with England. They rejected the authority of the king because they said that they were being treated unfairly. They weren't being given adequate justice, and so sought to form a more perfect union. They are accepting a union already existed. Right? But this is a more perfect one. This is a betterment of the union that already existed. They aren't saying that they are forming the contractual relations from the wilderness. That's just stupid. So I don't know why you would think you would even, when you say who is we, yeah, they mean the 13 colonies previous to this, or the independent individuals, or the colonies that have declared independence from Britain and are now calling themselves the United States. Right? I'm not a liberal, but if you're going to call into context the we, right, again, you do it based on how do we form a conception of self in relation to a contract? How do we form the I? You'd have to say something like the I presupposes the we, like Levinas says, or I think is it an Ubuntu saying where I am because we are? Like that would be more foundational, right? You're making a metaphysical claim. The people, the people are a union which can't exist in the state of nature at all. Not just North America, but always. However, the United States was not born out of the state of nature as liberal ideology would have it, although no liberal believes that it was born out of the state of nature. That is absolutely ridiculous. Please give your head a wobble. And again, this is a hypothetical, not a historical event. From what method would hypothetical savages in the state of nature be able to form some kind of council by which they would agree to form a civil society? Have you read any of these thinkers at all? This isn't about we are going to agree a council. This is about we are murdering each other, let's stop. It's the formulation of a civil union and central justice. So even if the union existed, it's about bettering that union, inclined towards certain rights which are being developed and understood in relation to our natural faculties and understanding our desires. See, what you don't understand is in the United States Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union was in fact a typo. What they meant to write was to form a union, right? Because they thought it didn't exist. So this whole more perfect union, oh no, that was a typo, right? They're just stupid. They just didn't even realize in the most important document in their civilization that they were writing that they just made a mistake there. Simply formed by the way suggesting of social contract, atomized individuals do not come together to rationally agree to create a state. Instead, people are born and raised in a civilization which contains a set of traditions into which each person is habituated as they grow up. Yeah, absolutely, I agree, and so does every liberal thinker ever. They do think we are atomized in the sense that we don't have any universal shared human nature, unless you, Carl, are arguing that there is, essentially, a shared conception of self. That there is the existence of a universal man, right? Are you going to argue for that, Carl? Are you? After what you said in your first article, are you going to be the one that says, actually, there is what it's like to be British, and in what it's like to be British is a universal, it's a limited universal, and then so there's what it's like to be a human? Right? Are you gonna say that, Carl? Are you? Are you gonna do it? Over the process of time, due to the pressures of our experience, states arise in primitive forms and become more sophisticated over time as knowledge accumulates and the situation dictates. I mean, yes, absolutely. And you know who would say this? Rawls. Not Rawls. Rousseau. Rousseau would be saying this. This would be exactly what Rousseau is saying. You're indoctrinated into a state, and that state develops over time. However, that state mightn't be acting in accordance with your interests, and so you, as an individual, need to do something about it. It is the seizure of power in existing society by an ideological minority that enables liberal states to be formed, not through naturalistic process of wandering individuals aggregating together and consciously forming a state through reason. I'd like to point out, again, Rousseau is accepting this because he is arguing for social conditioning. He thinks you are being indoctrinated into a society which is ideologically constraining you or putting you in chains, quote unquote. Social contract theory is a rationalistic attempt, right? Rationalistic, what do you mean by rationalistic? Do you mean it's not rationalism, right? Like, a lot of these thinkers are empiricists, actively going against rationalism. So they would say it's an empirical analysis. It's not a rationalistic attempt. But if you just mean that it is an attempt to reason, like, yes, it's a theory based on reason, I guess. To explain the natural, okay, kind of, or rather what is actually happening. Intuitive, I don't know what he means by this. Irrational consequences of human beings, irrational consequences, as hierarchical animals living together in peace. Why is it an irrational consequence that hierarchical animals, even if we accept that we are hierarchical animals, are living together in peace? Why is that an irrational consequence? What's absurd about hierarchical animals living together in peace? Like, you see that in other animals, which don't have social contracts. Social contract theorists aren't trying to explain why we live together in peace. They're trying to find justifications for ethics and politics, or the foundations of ethical and political justification. They're not just trying to give a historical account of why we are living together in peace. Two conceptions of rights underpin Lockean and Rousseauian views of liberalism. The first is shared by the founding fathers and summarized in the term inalienable rights. Neither school of thought seems to support such a notion. And so he goes on to quote the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is John Locke, through and through. John Locke says that you have a right to life. This is all derived from your essentially self-interested nature, which essentially defines what you are, and is present in the fact that you are an acting agent trying to attain an end. So you know that you want something. The fact that you know that you want something has been given to you by your Creator. It is your essential nature. You cannot it cannot be taken away from you without taking your life itself. In terms of what you have a right to, you have a right to your own life. You have a right to your body, right? You have a right to your labor. So you have a right to life, liberty, and happiness, and the pursuit of happiness. Is it me, or did that quote just say the life, liberty, and happiness, but in different terms, right? So the whole argument that he's saying is that nobody can will himself to go against his own life and property, right? That they can't will against their own good, right? So the outcome is the common good. We all, the collective good, right? We all will for each other's will to be the same and respected. The same as Rousseau says, we all will for the general will. In the general will, I am given equal share, while I'm given equal consideration in terms of having control over my own body, having control over my own property, having, and so on. Like, so he actually is saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Like, As we can see, Locke suggests that people literally give up or alienate a proportion of their natural rights. They give up the equality, liberty, and executive power they had in the state of nature. I'm supposing that's what you think is going against life, liberty, and happiness, right? What is the equality, liberty, and executive power they had, Carl? What was their equality? Equality of what? Station? Equality of, like, opportunity? They're giving up their equal social status to enter into a society. Liberty. Liberty to do what? To trespass upon another's rights? To act upon another? To, act in anywhere they want, to labour anywhere they want and claim whatever they want? And what's their executive power? The power to punish. It's the power to act in force against another. So they give up their right to retributive justice inherent within them. But what do they do it for, Carl? Because for no rational creature can suppose to change his condition with intention to be worse. So all of this, right, the equality, liberty, and executive power that they had in the state of nature is replaced with a common good that puts them in a better situation than they were previously in. They actually end up with a greater equality, liberty, and justice than the power was essentially aimed towards. So through justice, all of these are maintained. That's the point. Rousseau took this view even further and suggested that the social contract requires the sacrifice of all of our rights in exchange for our civil rights, which are provided by the state. These clauses, properly understood, may be reduced to one: the total alienation of each associate together with all his rights to the whole community for the first place, as each gives himself absolutely the conditions that are the same for all, and being so, no one has any interest in making them burdensome to others. Right? Wait a minute. What does he say? I think I actually might have a quote for this. In his explanation of how this functions, he says, each man, in giving himself to everyone, gives himself to no one, and the right over himself that the others get is matched by the right that he gets over each of them. So he gains as much as he loses, and he also gains the extra force for the preservation of what he has. Carl, he's not saying you give up everything to everyone and receive nothing in return. He is saying because of the abstract nature of the general will, it embodies only the particularity from which you yourself actually obtain. And so you gain the universal right of property, which can then be defended. You gain rights, your right to your body, to your power, to everything that you had previously. By engaging in the universality of the self, you will find yourself and gain more. Right? So he's not saying you are losing anything. He specifically says, you give your right, when you give yourself to everyone, you are giving yourself to no one. The right over himself that others get is matched by the right he gets over each of them. You give only what you take. So what he's saying there, Carl, unless you disagree, is that because you are participating in the goods of the state, you are agreeing to defend the goods of the state. That your life is not just the particular interest driven by sheer desire, which would make you a slave to your appetites, but instead you now have civic duties, and that by engaging in those civic duties, you are more free. Because engaging in those civic duties means that you can have a body of the people which seek to preserve the lives of each other, that other people will seek to preserve your life, that you will not only try to preserve your own in relation to others, but now that you have that your private interests are only possible through, have been made possible through public interests. So he's basically saying, don't try to circumvent the goods of the state by doing off when we're entering a war, because if we enter a war, all of the goods of the state that you've benefited from were only made possible because of the agreement that you would act to defend your neighbour, to defend this social institution in the first place. So he's really just holding you to your own, one, he's saying that you're doing the same thing. You're going to have to preserve your own life, right? And you, as an individual now, are no longer a mere particular, but a universal. Okay? Which is why he says, and receiving from this act of unity its common identity, its life, and its will. This public person that is formed by the union of all other persons is called a city. Used to be called a city, and is these days called a republic or public body. You are receiving your identity. This is what it means to be French, to be British, to be Italian, whatever, right? This is what it means to have that identity. And so you will be shirking off that identity if you betray it. So if you go, oh, well, I'm British, but I'm not willing to die for my country in order to protect it from invaders, you're not British. That's what he's saying. He's saying that you have a civic duty, and you can't deny those civic duties whilst maintaining yourself as part of the general will. In both the Lockean and Rousseauian view of liberalism, there is no concept of inalienable rights at all. So an inalienable right doesn't mean that that a right can't be trespassed upon at all. As well, I think a lot of people like to say inalienable rights can't be broken. No, like Locke even agrees that you can lose your life if you kill someone. You can have your life taken from you. So it's not like this can't be or that you can't ever perform an action which would risk another's life. Like, they do actually agree with this. I know that Cosmic Skeptic makes the mistake with Locke as well. In neither conception of rights are those provided that the state is by the state inalienable, as in the Declaration of Independence suggests. Locke argues that natural right is actually the foundation of political right. So yes, it is for Locke. It's inalienable because it is derived from your nature itself, and that nature is essentially what we have construed as the universality within the state of justice, in the justice of the state. Moreover, what could be meant by an inalienable right anyway, and it seems to be a more excessively idealistic statement that the cold reality of nature does not itself respect. If something were to be literally inalienable, it would be surely logical or physically impossible to alienate, rather than being merely a moral injunction against alienation. One, it's a moral injunction against alienation in the sense that it is that if you were to take this away from someone, you are taking essentially their humanity away from them. It's not like it is both socially prohibited, right, but also rationally impossible. If like, Locke's not saying you can't be enslaved, and neither is Rousseau, right? They are saying to do that is to take away your identity. It is to take away what you are and who you are. To violate your nature, right? That's like, it's to violate your reason, okay? That's what they're doing here. It's not like you can't be killed. Like, to think that these people meant you couldn't be killed and that you're immortal would be ridiculous. They don't mean that. They mean that if you were to take away someone's life, you are taking away them. You can't have the individual without, the individual cannot be themselves without owning themselves. And that this ownership is implicit in your being, right? Which is why self-ownership is the foundation of these rights in Locke. So maybe just read them. Okay, yes, the inalienable rights. Each year someone quotes that magnificent poetry. What right to life has man who is drowning in the Pacific? The ocean will not hearken to his cries. What right to life? I mean, like, as if like it's a yes, but you're not an ocean. Okay, what right to life has a man who must die to save his children? If he chooses to save his own life, does he do so as a matter of right? For Rousseau, yes, actually, yes, it is to maintain the rights-based structure from which those rights are actually gained. If two men are starving and cannibalism is the only alternative to death, which man's right is inalienable? This is where Hegel would argue for what's called a state of tragedy, where both situations are both right and wrong simultaneously, because the rights cannot be respected. So it's actually tragedy. So they are inalienable. Like, the rights exist. It's that to respect them is to annihilate them. So it's a position of tragedy, essentially. And it's right as to liberty. The heroes who signed that great document pledged themselves to buy liberty with their lives. Liberty is never inalienable. It must be redeemed regularly with the blood of patriots, or it always vanishes. Literally what Rousseau argued for before, and you actually argued against, right? Like Rousseau is saying that that you have the right to die, that you have to die in order for the state to exist. But he's not saying that it goes against your rights. He's saying that you're maintaining your rights. So, okay. Of the all so-called natural humans' rights that have ever been invented, liberty is the least likely to be cheap, and it is never free of cost. The third right, the pursuit of happiness, it is indeed inalienable, but it is not a right. It is simply a universal condition that tyrants cannot take away nor patriots restore. Cast me into a dungeon, burn me at the stake, crown me king of kings. I can pursue happiness as, crown me as God. That's a bit blasphemous. I can pursue happiness as long as my brain lives, but neither gods nor saints, wise men nor subtle chugs can ensure that I will catch it. But I mean, I don't know if the author understands, but that is, and not, to be fair, it's hard to say the author because the author is not represented in the characters, right? Like Shakespeare, for example, is often attributed to the views of someone like Hamlet, but that doesn't necessarily follow. Okay, like this is the point, actually, of all of these rights, that they cannot be rationally taken away from you, that they are necessarily in your nature. That's what Locke's getting at. And Rousseau's saying that in terms of the right to life, you have the right to life. When you engage in, you have the right to your life, to the control of your life, your liberty, to pursue happiness. But when you engage in the structure of the society, you have the same right, but now you are a universal man and not only a particular man. So you now have the need to sustain the life of the state. So it is an inalienable right, and you must, seek to maintain the structure which essentially maintains that right, or rather respects that right. Just because it's inalienable doesn't mean that everyone's going to respect your rights. That's essentially the whole point of this political theorizing, really. Arguments for liberal democracy generally rest on a rather lazy concept that is usually encapsulated in the phrase "the will of the people." In this second treatise, Locke repeatedly refers to the will of the society, and Rousseau famously uses the term the general will. Hobbes sidesteps this problem by placing society as entered into a social construct under the absolute power of a single monarch, making him the autocrat and author of the political will of such a state, while insulating him from any possibility of accountability. Somewhat with Hobbes, yes, he does kind of do that, but he's also saying that it is basically because we all want a sovereign, that it is rational. He's a rational egoist, right? Like, he's saying we all should want the sovereign. So it is kind of a general will that we all want the sovereign. The will of the people in Locke is just what people want. Like, it is just like, if as a mass, as a herd, we engage in a kind of shared action. That is the will and the general will. In terms of Rousseau, it is the willed interests, the respect of all of our interests. So like, I want my own rights, and if I want your rights as well, then we essentially, if we join together, we can gain additional goods. So if I want what is good for me, then I want what is good for you in Rousseau. So we end up with the general will, which is somewhat the case in Locke as well. We all will for justice, and so we must will for central justice. So it's been built from particulars. However, we can see that the factional I can't never say that word. Plurality simply hasn't happened. The capture of the United States between two political parties is particularly stark as it screws between the diametric poles of Republican and Democrat, and these are the two viable political alternatives from which independence voters have to choose. Third parties do and can develop in a two-party state. That's where the Labour Party came from. You have the Liberal Democrats gaining power right now. The Green Party's gained more authority. UKIP gained 4 million votes in the Brexit campaign, which really undercut Labour. What can I say? Like, third parties do have an impact. You should consider voting for a third party. Like, what, just because we live in a two-party state doesn't mean we have to. Take the United Kingdom as an example. We have the Green Party, the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, and much of the Conservative Party, who are all to some greater or lesser degree progressive liberal parties, because our society is, for the most part, liberal. Much of the political debate between these parties is not in opposition, but instead who has prepared the ante sufficiently as to be as liberal as possible on any given issue which the public is invited to weigh, which has the most realistic prospect of achieving liberal ideals against illiberal nature of reality. Yeah, so like our political, like the body of the people are liberal and vote in a liberal system. When a political system, this is, I mean, like you want to say, really, if you're talking about legislatory capture, right, which is what he's trying to talk about, then I suggest you start talking about the influence of private corporations, or you start talking about the ideological influence in something like our institutions, which are essentially producing. And this is where you start talking about things that the Marxists would talk about, which is like cultural hegemony, like someone like Gramsci would say, where the ideas are producing the people, not the people producing the ideas. And this would be more ideological and less political. And the political ramifications of this are essentially a group of people from which the political majority are always going to be liberal, because the liberal ideology has a grip upon the people. And that is being maintained through the power structure of the state. Now, if you were to say something like that, okay, maybe I could get behind it. We're not really seeing that right now, are we? When a political system is captured by liberalism to a degree that the genuinely traditional or alternative political viewpoints are simply edged out of the public discourse by virtue of liberal prejudice against non-liberal ideas. How is it liberal prejudice? I mean, like liberals voting for liberalism is not prejudice against non-liberal ideas. The political environment, and also you're reducing them down to just prejudicial. It might be through reason. They might think that your ideas are shit. Like, it's democracy. Like, get used to it. The political environment becomes monotone and certain ideas become unthinkable. Yes, that's a good thing. For example, fascism. Fascism should be fucking unthinkable. Are we reading Karl? Are we reading Foucault right now? And the entire society is captured by politics in which many people disagree, but feel that they have few opinions to vote against. Well, yeah, but then they should vote for a third party. Like, you can't. There's many third parties. Alternative parties. The will of the people is rarely proportionally articulated by such a political capture, which shows in the view that people have for democracy itself. In 2020, Pew Research realized the results of their global polling, which found that most people in democratic societies were dissatisfied with democracy. What do you mean dissatisfied with their voting system, not democracy? Like, I don't think most people are like, I don't like democracy. Yeah, support for democratic principles. Fair judiciary, okay. Okay, so the majority are wanting a fair judiciary system. They're wanting free gender equality, free religion, regular elections, free speech. The majority of people want free opposition, human rights groups to be free, freedom on the internet, freedom of... How can you... This goes against your position, Karl. And so this is the Global Attitude Survey on democratic rights popular globally. Okay, let's see if maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm jumping the gun. Maybe it's... Okay, they're dissatisfied with how it's working. Okay, most aren't satisfied with how their democracies are working. Few people think that it's run for the benefits of all. Yeah, okay, I agree. But the majority of them... But this argued against you, Karl. Democratic rights, popular globally, but commitment to them is not always strong. Support for freedom of speech is up. Support for freedom of press is up. Freedom of press is 77% in the UK. So, dissatisfied with the way that democracy is functioning. Fair judiciary and gender equality is highest rated democratic principles. Attitudes towards democratic rights and institutions. Country median, 82% for fair judicial system. A 34 country median on competitive elections, 65%. So, the want competitive elections. In free speech, it is 64%. For people can say what they want, people can report what they want, and people can use the internet. Gender equality is the vast majority again, 74 and 68. Practice their religion freely, and women have the same rights as men. I don't know. Okay, right, Karl. Maybe just read the thing you post. Overall, most people in democratic societies were dissatisfied with democracy. Yes. The way that it's functioning, but not democracy, mate. They were all calling for democratic principles. Did not believe their elected representatives cared about people like them and did not think that their state was run for the benefit of people. Yeah, sure. They all agree that their society is imperfect and they wish to do something about it. But they do agree with democracy. So they do want the will of the people. They're just saying that the will of the people is not being adequately represented in that current society. which is fair enough because that's what the liberal thinkers thought as well. Rousseau very famously thought that. That's what Locke did, thought that as well. They didn't have idealized, they weren't idealizing the ways in which democracy worked. They understood that there was problems. Other polls revealed that 64% of British people and 71% of Americans do not believe that their countries are heading in the right direction. I completely agree. People like you are in charge. How can it be reasonably argued that when a large majority of the people believe the country is heading in the wrong direction, only the small minorities of people can be satisfied with the way things are, that the will of the people is being enacted? I mean, I think that it's fair enough to say that we're not a true democracy. I think that's true, that we're only a partial democracy. And in fact, if anything, it's the two-party state's part of it, but it's also largely part of the power of corporations. And I think liberals would actually argue the fact that these liberal rights aren't being respected. Enlightened leadership. Even those theorists who accept that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, such as James Madison, still labour under the idea that the democratic nature of liberal states will enable a broad selection of quality candidates to achieve office. As each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens, the large in the small republic, it will be more difficult or unworthy candidates to practice with success at vicious arts by which elections are too often carried, and the suffrages of the people being more free will more likely descend at the men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive established characters. I think he's largely right. He's just again saying that because we are interested in because we are interested in how these elections turn out, we have a mechanism from which we can call this into question. Now, he's not saying I don't think that this has to be the only mechanism, but that the fact that the mechanism is actually there means that there is a way to hold these individuals to account, so that the more abrasive ideologues can never really take power. Which is why, we find that the extremists typically try to take power through force, through putches and revolutions and all that nonsense. I think it's still probably true. I mean, like, what we do find is that the abuses of power that we see in autocracies are much higher. That they just are much higher. I mean, you only have to look towards somewhere like Russia for an example of that. China. But again, like, I think Aristotle pointed out that in terms of measuring the interests of the individuals in the state, the larger the state gets, the harder it becomes. So as a society grows bigger, there are issues in terms of selecting leadership in general. But yes, I think it's still largely superior, as we can see in the alternatives that exist. It also seems that there is a contradiction between the concept of the will of the people and their enlightened leadership that emerges within liberal theory. If the will of the people, not terribly wise on average, should... Oh, for God's sake. So the point is to say that they aren't wise as a particular, but as a group, they are wiser than any given individual. It's like saying, like, how if you took a group of people, and let's say a group of 100 people, right? And let's say they are all pretty bad at maths, and you ask that group of 100 people, right, a intermediate level maths question, and then you took a sample size of one person, right? You ask them the maths question. Which is more likely to get the maths question correctly? Is it the large group of people, or is it the singular person? If the people are not terribly wise on average and should elect in among themselves those people of outstanding character, why should the enlightened leadership not find themselves in the opposition to the people when making policy? It's not that they are enlightened leadership, they are representations of the will of the people in the first place. And the will of the people are essentially more virtuous than their specific governance. You would elect the individual who is the person that's most likely to carry out and represent the will of the people. You don't essentially elect a technocrat. That's not what democracy is about. And it's not what liberal democracy is about. You're wanting to elect those virtuous people, those good people who are going to do what is the will of the people, understand the will of the people, and that's why they're being elected, because they are putting the policies forward, they are putting the topics forward that should be getting them elected. Unfortunately, often it is subverted by flattery, which is a problem that Plato recognized in Gorgias, and essentially turns it into the ship of fools. That is a genuine problem in terms of democracy. But it's not a contradiction between the idea of voting and the idea of having the best possible representative. There's no issue there at all. The issues coming external from the issue, which actually Aristotle would have said is the bedrock of democracy rather than constitutional governance, is that the constitution of the people is being subverted by a particular force, and that particular force might be a group of individuals who are flattering the vicious majority in order to obtain an end against the good of the people. But that doesn't go against the idea of a constitutional government. It doesn't go against the idea of essentially of actually voting and having the people having their say and having representatives. It goes against the idea of it goes against the idea of a bunch of individuals voting on issues from which they cannot understand, or voting in relation to their desires and what they want to be the case. So, but ultimately, again, like Aristotle thinks that it is still the best form of governance, because the virtues of the individuals are most prominent in democracy or in constitutional governance in this larger voting group than they are in smaller groups, where the vices are distilled in smaller groups. The specific psychological biases, their own interests, their personal vices, especially at the point of a monarchy, is distilled to the highest level, where if you get a bad monarch, they are the most vicious and worst form of governance, which again we see in autocracies today, where you look towards somewhere like Russia and they'll be much better off with an actual democracy, because even if the bedrock of the society isn't as virtuous as a comparative society, largely the people are voting for individuals who are representing their interests, and that would mean not sending them to die needlessly in war. Of course, this also is dependent upon things like freedom of information, which can also be subverted. So you should be necessarily, if you have a brain between your ears, you should be calling for free press, free governance, these things that are essentially put forward in the freedom of information, these things that are put forward in liberal democracies. If these people on average in their intelligence, wisdom and habits, this expressed a kind of common will to have their civilization evolve in one direction, while the select group of enlightened leaders rationally decide that in fact the civilization should instead evolve into another direction, which set of wills should win out? Aristotle talks about this, and obviously the most virtuous group should be the leaders, but again, the largest group is more likely to have the greater virtue, simply for the fact of its size. So even in the group of virtuous aristocrats, which are not oligarchs for Aristotle, oligarchy is the perversion of that. The aristocrats would still be worse than the democrats, or the constitutional democracy. Is sovereignty instead invested in the people, or is it vested in their leadership? Is it not inevitable that the leadership will develop into a class in which they find agreement with itself, rather than from the people which is purportedly selected from? That is what's called oligarchy, and that's what we see as a subversion or a perversion of democracy. They are subverting democracy. You're not pointing out a problem with democracy itself. You're saying that there aren't you would need necessary safeguards that prevent this kind of class-based mentality from forming. I agree. If that's what you're saying, yes, I think there needs to be rules and laws in place that prevent this, and that's what Aristotle seeks to do as well. He's saying, like, for example, you need to make it the law that everyone must turn up, but when the poor turn up, they get fed, and he tries to balance the interests of everyone in society to get the greatest number of people essentially politically engaged in the first place, and also prevent that people using their political sway to essentially prevent a fair, just political arrangement. Like, if you're saying that like our leadership is undemocratic and that they are being voted in but not as correct representatives, I mean, I would agree with you. But again, that's not a problem with the idea of it's a problem with enlightened leadership, I guess, but that no liberal really wants that. They want good representatives. So yeah. I don't believe that Sargon has any conception of what liberalism actually is. He contradicts himself numerous times. He seems to represent liberal thinkers in a way which they themselves directly reject. So I don't think he's read the thinkers. I don't think that he's understood the thinkers when he has read them. And I'm not even sure if he's just being disingenuous. He made that many mistakes. So this was my review of whether Sargon understands liberalism.